A moonlit bog as the Abhartach returns from his mound, the moment between sleep and hunger in the old legend. His hall and never sat again with their parents at feast. Rumor named him small, but it was the measure of his appetite for dominion that kept the people quiet for seasons. Tales of his appetite, both of power and, later, of blood, traveled along hedge and road like smoke. Villagers driving a black iron stake through the cairn in the old ritual meant to bind the dead. The greater myths of the island speak of kings who died and departed. Abhartach's death would not be of that nature. A secret plot was drawn in the half-light of a winter, at a time when the peat fires were low and tempers burned hotter for lack of comfort. Men who had lost sons, women whose livestock disappeared in the night, farmers with staked fields glaring to the sky, all agreed on a plan: the chieftain must be removed. They found their chance in a quarrel over a woman of good sense, and a blade that tasted iron found Abhartach's side. He fell with a curse that tasted of prophecy. Where most would think a tyrant's final breath would close the story, the earth itself refused to take its final shape around his body. The funeral mound raised over his corpse was not enough, the stone cairn not heavy enough to seal a mind bent upon continuance. By dusk, a different sorrow crept across the settlements. A neighbor sickened without fever, the village dog lay with a mouthful of blood dried at its muzzle, and a child woke as if pricked while asleep. At first, explanations were small and human: blame the weather, blame the season, blame an unlucky turn. But misfortune has a way of sharpening suspicion until it takes on edges of its own. An old Karak man, who had once tended to the dead as he tended to the nets, called to mind an older fear. He remembered rites that were used when a corpse was thought to be bound to the earth by unnatural will: a stake-driven heart stead through chest, iron hammered into bone, a certain mix of ash and bog moss to prevent a restless return. Such measures were whispered in fragments, often spoken with the addition of a prayer or a curse. Men smoothed stones over Abhartach's cairn and returned to their work, but the sickness did not relent. The air tasted of iron, wells once bright with trout grew stale. The old midwives said the babies were unsettled. A child's cheeks hollowed prematurely, and the mark of 2 teeth was seen in the crook of her elbow. Fear, slow at first, became a tight band that circled the parish. The priests and learned men were called. Some counseled binding through holy rites, others through older customs, things touched by the otherworld and made practical for survival. It was a rift between the living practices of faith and the older folklore that had never quite been permitted to die. On a fog-wet night they opened the cairn with hands that trembled. The corpse lay small, as it had been in life, but the color of its hands was wrong, too fresh, as if washed in a silver stream. The men who had wielded the shovel looked upon it with a sort of coldness. One of the elder women cried out, convinced of what the children had hinted at: the Abhartach did not sleep. He had awoken hungry. The word spread then, not with the neat certainty of law but with the lurching momentum of panic. A man in the next town reported blood sapping from his child's wrist while she slept. Cows were found standing in the fields with their bellies scoured as if by a predator that left no tracks. That the tyrant should retain a need for blood was intolerable, that this need should be fulfilled from the living was obscene. Proposals of iron and consecration gained strength. Charms, once reserved for harvest blessings, were repurposed. The culture of the people became the toolbox for their salvation. It is here that the tale slips between fact and enchantment. Some say Abhartach could rise because he had been too cunning to accept the limits of death. Others argued his heart was not whole, that the burial itself had been bungled, that a trick of the grave had let his will seep like water back into the world. Arguments notwithstanding, one certainty governed the knights: the living had to be defended. A choice was made to fashion a stake not of a tree but of iron, black, heavy, hammered by the smith whose hands had once crafted plowshares. Iron held the earth's memory and the memory of war. It was thought to have the power to pin wool to soil. The smith's son would later recite how they heated the iron until the smell of sweat and peat and iron mingled, how the stake sang as it cooled. They returned at dusk to Abhartach's cairn, carrying the stake, a bowl of salt, a bundle of holly, and a chant half in Latin and half in the old tongue. The pounding of the stake, when it came, was not swift. It was a ritual performed with the careful cruelty of those who must kill twice, once with blade, again with custom. When the iron bit bone and closed around the rib, the earth seemed to sigh. The story says the body writhed and that its voice was like dry leaves. Then, finally, the mound settled into a ordinary silence. For nights after, the people watched the horizon for a return. Sometimes, out on the bog, a light would be seen, a small glimmer that could be a will-o'-the-wisp, or the eye of something that had learned to wait. But the immediate hunger eased. Whether the stake was the true end or simply the first answer that bought a village its breath, the tale persisted and grew in telling, deepening the contours of fear and the means by which people resist what they cannot understand. Gravebound hunger and the quest for peace. Even after the iron was set and the cairn closed, the story of the Abhartach lived both in the bodies of those who remembered and in the land itself. Memory is tenacious in places where life and death meet on a daily basis. Peat keeps its secrets as tightly as the earth holds bones, and the people who worked that ground could feel a shift in the seasons. The Abhartach story became a way to explain small tragedies and to impose a measure of order on randomness. When a child was found pale and unaccounted for, the tale supplied a villain and a ritual response. When a man returned from the sea with his eyes hollowed by drowning or by sorrow, the narrative of the king's curse offered a language for grief. This is one reason folklore persists. It is not merely entertainment but a map for living under the weight of misfortune. The blending of charm and smithcraft, iron, salt, and holly set near a bog as safeguards in the legend. There were, however, practical consequences that the tale could not excuse. A hill where a tyrant had once been buried changed usage. No one planted crops too close. New rites were adopted. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, the body was treated not as an ending but as a potential continuation. Salt and bog moss were more often placed with the dead. A piece of iron might be left upon the chest. The placement of the body was considered with a caution that had not been customary before. Priests and charm workers argued but also learned from one another. The liturgy adopted, in pockets, a few of the older precautions. Certain prayers were said at funerals that had been forgotten, and certain songs were sung to make the borders between the living and the dead more obvious and strong. Meanwhile, the old women of the town, the bearers of kitchen lore and bitter remedies, kept watch over infants whose hands trembled in sleep and performed small rites in secret, using thread and thorns to stitch a child's dream back into safety. Not every telling of Abhartach's return involves the same details. In some villages he was truly monstrous, a figure who rose each night and drank from the living as one drinks from a cup. In others, the emphasis is on the social horror, that a man who had abused power could bind his malice to the land and continued to make life miserable for ordinary folk. Where the story grew teeth was in its ability to combine both fears, literal blood drinking and the metaphorical sucking of life from communities under unfair rule. That duality made the figure of Abhartach useful to bards and preachers alike. It was a cautionary figure for chieftains and a validation of the cunning measures taken by the weak to protect themselves. Generations later, as the island changed with new kings and later, new laws, the Abhartach persisted in the tale lore precisely because rituals adapted to new circumstances. Iron turned from a stake to a symbol, iron gates, iron nails over thresholds, while the chants shifted to include saints invoked for protection. Even so, when famine came or disease spread, villagers would sometimes be heard reciting the old words, half prayer and half curse, in case the boundaries had thinned. There was a hum of a communal memory that vibrations along the hedgerows. People could not erase their fear because it had been proven true often enough to justify caution. There are episodes where the legend shifts into a different register of belief, the notion that Abhartach had bargains with the otherworld. Folk magic in Ireland is generous with exchange. Leave a trinket for the fair folk and they will leave you peace, and so in some versions the chieftain had bartered away his rest for power in life. After he died, the bargain still bound him, he had to feed. These versions are darker and more complicated, because they posit a world where moral order is not enough. You must also be adept at the mechanics of exchange with forces that do not play by human rules. A family might leave milk at the edge of the bog to placate a hunger they could not name. A shepherd might keep a charm of iron near his breast. These acts, small and ritualized, knitted the social fabric back together, offering people a sense of agency. The Abhartach narrative also touches on justice and accountability. If a ruler could persist in inflicting suffering after death, what of those who had let him rule? The stories tilt between condemnation and empathy. Some narrators ask whether the rise of a tyrant is simply a failure of the people to act sooner. Other tellers point to the complexity of living under threats and pressures, and the terrible bargains communities make to survive. Over time, the character of Abhartach became a moral instrument, a dramatized example of the consequences of cruelty, and an instructive tale for those who wield power. It warned not only of what happens when a tyrant is not properly buried but of what happens when a people accept small tyrannies for the sake of quiet. The most enduring images of the tale are the tactile ones, the iron stake hot from the forge, the smell of peat smoke and wet wool, the cold press of night air over the bog, and the sound of a hammer that rings long after the hands that held it are gone. These sensory recollections are what keep the legend alive in oral culture. When modern ear hears the name Abhartach, it brings with it the sense of a place where the line between the living and the dead was thinner, where power could cling and where ordinary people had to invent customs to survive. Folklorists have traced echoes of the Abhartach into other stories of revenants across Ireland and Britain, noting similar uses of iron, staked graves, and salt as protective agents. Whether the original was a literal blood-drinking corpse or a vivid metaphor for oppressive rule, the steps taken by the living, rituals, charms, and cooperation, are the real heart of the story. In that sense, Abhartach remains less an isolated monster than a mirror held up to communities deciding to keep one another safe through known rites and shared vigilance.